So my name is Anita Desikan. I'm joined by my colleague, Casey Kilman. We're both researchers at an organization called the Union of Concerned Scientists. We're here to talk to you about the COVID vaccine. We're just kind of presenting, what the science says. And these are all this information is being backed up and pulled from like really official sources, mostly from the center, the CDC, the Center of Disease and Control and Prevention, also the Food and Drug Administration, and some other federal and state government websites. So who are we? The Union of Concerned Scientists is a nonprofit organization that's been going on for about 50 years now. And we work on science advocacy issues. So me and Casey work in a specific group called the Center for Science and Democracy. And so we're really, really concerned about the idea of science being incorporated into federal decision-making processes. So we want science to govern, like say, when they create standards for air pollution, for instance. And we've been working a lot on the pandemic response and the idea of science guiding that. And that includes also vaccine development. I'll also just stipulate that UCS is no way affiliated with pharma companies. We don't get funding from pharma companies. We don't get funding from government agencies either. And me and Casey personally aren't affiliated with either of them. This is who we are. We're both scientists. I have a master's in public health and a master's in science, and I've been a public health researcher for a number of years right now. I'm currently on the West Coast, but I'm usually living in DC. If you want to know a fun fact about me, I play acoustic guitar, and it's my stress reliever, especially during the pandemic. I love playing country roads, for instance. And Casey, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I can. So my name is Casey Coleman. I work with Anita at the Center for Science and Democracy. I also have a master's in public health. Anita and I actually went through the same program at George Washington. I am calling you from Washington, DC, but I'm originally from Illinois and I went to school in Wisconsin. So I'm a fellow Midwesterner. And a fun fact about me is that I am currently living with 2 roommates, but also 2 cats, one of which joined us for a conversation earlier. And Oliver, who joined us earlier, is probably about 20 pounds, but it's not because he's overweight. He's just a very large cat. And every time my building manager sees him, she always comments like, "That's a really big cat." So yeah, that's a little about me.
Perfect. So we'll move on to the main part. And one of the main questions we wanted to kind of broach right away is this idea of how we can even place our trust in COVID vaccines. And we're thinking right now about a very long, very egregious history of medical racism in the US, especially towards communities of color. So therefore, it is understandable, it's expected, and it's even rational to have mistrust towards science agencies, especially if you're a person of color. And to give some examples, the Tuskegee syphilis study was this study that was started in the 30s and ended in the 70s due to actually an investigative journalist finding out about this. But they were bringing in low-income individuals who were from the African-American community who had syphilis, and the doctors literally denied these individuals from getting effective syphilis treatments for years. So people even died as a result of this harm. Their family members got hurt. They got hurt. It's still very much considered an egregious, horrific experience for the participants and a black mark in the science community. Another example is Henrietta Lacks. So she died in the early 1950s. She came from a low-income background. She's African-American. She lived in Baltimore, Maryland, and she had a very, very aggressive form of a cancer. And so, you go to your doctor when you have these things, and you want to get help from them. And the doctor did, but he also took cells from her, and those cells just happened to have a certain unique property that led to an incredible number of medical discoveries, stuff that we're still benefiting from today. And yet, she died from this cancer, and her family, until very recently, didn't get compensated for this. So it's another example of a lack of informed consent and taking advantage of someone who's literally a person of color. So these egregiousness, they were, they they cause a lot of people to soul search and try to figure out ways that we can put safeguards in place so things like this don't happen. So one example of a safeguard is a literal office called the Office of Human Resource and Protection at the federal government. It's a sub-agency of the Department of Health and Human Services. And one of their primary jobs is just to make sure research is done ethically. Another safeguard is at every university and research center you can imagine, if any scientist proposes any study, they have to go through an ethical review. It's called an internal review board. The members on this board are both scientists and community members, and they have to go, if this ethic board said, no, this isn't right, then the scientists can't do their study. And vaccine trials have an even more higher standard because it's given to so many different people. For how vaccines work, I'll pass this to Casey.
So yeah, before we go into any more detail about the COVID vaccine, we wanted to just give some background about how vaccines work in general. So a vaccine is basically a way for us to kind of take advantage of the body's natural defense mechanisms by introducing a unharmful version or part of the virus. And this basically makes it so that your body can recognize this foreign invader and then start to build defenses. And it means that the next time you come into contact with the virus, kind of in the wild, your body will be able to protect itself. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more, I've linked to a really great video by ABC, and then the New York Times has a really great write-up on how vaccines work. And so specifically, if you're interested in knowing how the COVID-19 vaccines work, there are actually a variety of different vaccines. So of all the different vaccines that are being produced, there are 3 different types currently. The first type presents the body with a harmless piece of the virus that causes COVID-19. So it's not the whole virus, it's kind of like, I don't know, you can imagine it's like its arm or its leg, so that the body can recognize that. And this has been used for hepatitis B, whooping cough, and other vaccines. So you've likely had one of these vaccines before. The other type is one that uses a weakened live version of a different virus. So it kind of takes the bones or like the skeleton of a different virus, puts a little bit of the genetic material from the COVID-19 virus in it. And this is used to kind of introduce it into your body, and then your body can build defenses against it. And this technique has been used a lot since the 1970s, including for the Ebola vaccine recently. And then the third type teaches our cells how to make a protein to trigger an immune response inside our body. And we'll go into more detail on this, but this has been used for flu vaccines as well as Zika and rabies vaccines. Also cancer treatments. So if you've heard about different types of treatments that take advantage of the body's immune system to fight cancer, this is kind of what they're doing. And lastly, we just want to emphasize that none of these vaccines can give you COVID-19, and none of them interact with your DNA in any way. They're simply treating or teaching your body how to fight against the virus. And so the third type is actually the type that was used for both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. And we're just going to go into a little bit more detail. So basically, if you can imagine that this little ball with these spikes is a virus, a COVID virus. Inside it, there is genetic material, and just a little snippet of that genetic material creates these red spikes on the outside, which is kind of like the face of the virus. And so for this vaccine, they took that little snippet and put it in some liquid. So it's kind of like surrounded by a little bubble of lipids and liquid. And this is what is being used for the vaccine. And this, when it enters your body, so imagine that this big blue ball is a cell. Basically, it teaches that cell how to make those proteins, which are completely benign. They don't harm you in any way, but the cell can kind of mimic the COVID virus by putting these spikes outside of it. So it's kind of like pretending to be the COVID vaccine. And then your immune response will react to this, saying like, hey, what's up with these spikes? We don't want these, and start to build defenses against it. And it creates this long-term memory in the body that these spikes are not good, and we don't want them to be in our body, so we should kind of go after them if we see them again. And then after a couple weeks, this genetic material from the vaccine, as well as the spikes, will disappear and dissolve. And yeah, if you want to know any more information, I have added a couple links that really do a good job of kind of walking through the process of how these types of vaccines work. Oh, and that's the spikes dissolving away.
Yeah, and we'll go into a little bit more about what the science is saying of how they work. So like my colleague Casey mentioned, there have been 2 vaccines that have been approved. So that's Pfizer and Moderna. They've been tested in thousands of different people, and they try to be a bit open and publish the materials and protocols beforehand. So both showed evidence that they work. So they work in 95% of the time. And I'll mention that it's 2 doses for each of these vaccines. So are they safe? Both have been shown to be very safe. And I'll just give a note that health experts say if you're going to receive a reaction to a vaccine, it'll appear usually within 6 weeks, the vast majority of them. And so therefore they looked at participants for 8 weeks to kind of see for safety reasons. And the most common effects were just the same effects you might see when you get a flu vaccine. So, pain at the injection site, fatigue, headaches, that kind of thing. I'll also mention that Moderna is trying to test if children from ages 12 to 17, if the vaccine is also safe for them. So that's an ongoing study right now. Are they safe